I used to think I knew exactly what kind of man I was supposed to want. Not just prefer, not just be drawn to in some private instinctive way, but supposed to want, in the sense that the world around me had been handing me the same blueprint for years and calling it romance. Big shoulders, strong jaw, confident stride, the kind of man who looked good carrying a gym bag, who knew how to dominate a room without trying, who used words like discipline and grind and meant them like virtues. The kind of man people described with a certain approving tone, as if masculinity were a certification he had earned and displayed in public. For a long time, I mistook that approval for chemistry. I mistook social validation for desire. I mistook being chosen by those men for the same thing as being deeply seen by them. My name is Caroline, and if you had looked at my dating history from the outside, you would have thought I was extremely predictable. I dated football player types, finance bro types, former baseball guys who still carried themselves like they were walking from the locker room to the field, men whose arms strained the sleeves of their shirts and who always seemed to smell faintly of expensive cologne, layered over laundry detergent and clean sweat, men who liked bourbon, steaks, sports bars, minimalist apartments, and pretending they did not care very much about anything that might make them look needy or soft. They were handsome in a way that was easy to explain to other people. They photographed well. They looked right beside me in the narrow, polished way couples are often expected to look right. And for a while, I let that be enough. Actually, maybe enough is the wrong word. It was never enough. It was just familiar. It was legible. It was the kind of relationship other people understood instantly, which can be strangely seductive when you are younger and still half building yourself out of reflected opinions. I liked walking into a restaurant with a man who looked undeniably masculine. I liked the little glances from strangers, the subtle nod of approval from friends, the sense that I had acquired the sort of boyfriend women were meant to feel lucky to have. There was a safety in that performance, even when it did not feel safe in my body. There was relief in being recognized by the script, but being recognized by the script is not the same thing as being happy inside it. That took me a long time to learn, longer than I like admitting. The men I dated were not all cruel. It would be easier, maybe, if they had been. Easier to tell a neat story where I escaped villains and found something better. Most of them were decent enough in the ways people often are. They texted back. They made reservations. They remembered birthdays, most of the time. They were proud to be seen with me. Some of them were protective. Some were generous. A few even tried, sincerely, to be emotionally present. But there was always the same quiet architecture under everything, the same rigid frame holding the relationship in place. They had to be the men. Not just men in the neutral biological sense, but men in the theatrical, exhausting, heavily surveilled sense. They had to lead, decide, reassure, control, joke first, apologize last, and act as if any visible softness had to be rationed out carefully so no one mistook them for weak. And because they were locked into that role, I got locked into one too. I became acutely aware of myself around those men. Aware of how much space I took up, how much emotion I showed, how feminine I seemed, how easy I was to manage, how attractive I looked while still appearing effortless. I was always calibrating. Pretty, but not vain. Smart, but not threatening. Sensitive, but not inconvenient. Sexy, but only in approved ways. Open-minded, but never so open-minded that I made him uncomfortable. There was always this strange, silent agreement that his masculinity was the center of gravity in the relationship, and my job was to orbit it gracefully. After enough years of that, you stop noticing how tired you are because the tiredness becomes your normal climate. I remember one boyfriend, Tyler, who looked like every woman's fantasy if that fantasy had been designed by a sportswear brand. Tall, square-shouldered, blonde in that expensive-looking way some people are, perpetually tanned, always wearing fitted Henleys that made his body look engineered. He was kind to waiters, called his mother every Sunday, and could deadlift a ridiculous amount. On paper, there was nothing obviously wrong with him, but every conversation with him felt like walking on a polished floor in heels. I was always trying not to slip. If I brought up something emotional, he'd either try to solve it like a practical inconvenience or tease me just enough to make me feel foolish for caring so much. If he got insecure, which happened more than he would ever admit, it came out as withdrawal or little sarcastic digs. He wanted me soft, but not complicated. He wanted admiration without too much scrutiny. He wanted intimacy as long as it never threatened the story he told himself about being above vulnerability. Then there was Marcus, who had been a college wrestler and still carried that old hardness in his posture, as if his body had once been trained to meet every force with more force. He was passionate, magnetic, physically affectionate, and incredibly uncomfortable with anything he could not dominate with confidence. He once told me, after I asked him what he was afraid of, that women always wanted men to talk like therapists now. He said it jokingly, but not really jokingly. I laughed at the time because that is what women do when they sense a truth they are too tired to wrestle with. But I remember going home that night and staring at myself while I wiped off my makeup, feeling lonelier than I had any right to feel after spending an evening with someone technically so attentive. That was the pattern. The loneliness inside company, the emotional distance hidden inside conventional attraction, the strange deadness that settled over things once the novelty wore off and the gender performance remained. I kept trying to convince myself that maybe this was just adult love. Maybe everyone was faking a little. Maybe intimacy was always going to feel like negotiation under fluorescent lights. Then I met Christian, and within a few months, I realized how completely I had confused tension for chemistry and rigidity for strength. I met him on a rainy Wednesday evening when I had no business being anywhere except my own couch. A friend of mine, Lila, was turning 32 and insisted on doing a small birthday gathering at a wine bar downtown, the kind of place with velvet banquettes, tiny gold lamps on the tables, and enough candlelight to make everybody look half a memory. I almost canceled twice. I had just come out of another relationship with another conventionally masculine man who had made me feel, somehow, both overmanaged and underloved. I was depleted in that flat, boring way heartbreak sometimes works when it is not really heartbreak so much as accumulated disappointment. I did not want to flirt. I did not want to perform. I wanted to eat pasta in bed and not speak to anyone. But Lila is one of those friends who can smell self-isolation through a locked door, so I went. It had been raining all afternoon, and by the time I arrived, the sidewalks were shining black under the streetlights. The windows of the bar glowed amber against the wet city, and when I stepped inside, I got that immediate sensory hush that only certain places have, a dim warmth, the scent of citrus peel and wine and damp wool coats drying near the entrance, low jazz threading through the room. People were already gathered around a long table in the back. I kissed Lila hello, shrugged off my coat, and took the one remaining seat beside a man I didn't know. That was Christian. If I am honest, he did not strike me immediately as the sort of man I would tell my friends I had a crush on. Not because he wasn't attractive. He absolutely was. But his attractiveness asked something different of me. It was quieter, less broadcast. He had dark wavy hair that fell slightly over his forehead, thoughtful brown eyes, and a face that looked softer the longer you studied it, not in a weak way, just in a human way. He wore a charcoal jacket over a white shirt, and the fit was impeccable, but there was nothing aggressive about him. He did not sprawl. He did not project. He did not seem to be auditioning for anyone's idea of masculinity. He seemed settled in himself, which turned out to be much rarer and much sexier than I had known how to value. We started talking because the person across from us spilled a little red wine, and we both reached for napkins at the same time. I made some small joke about that being the true beginning of adulthood, carrying silent awareness of stain removal at all times, and he laughed in a way that felt genuinely surprised rather than socially efficient. From there, it just kept going. Books first, music next, then cities we had loved and cities that had disappointed us. Then the weird relief of canceled plans when you are too overstimulated to pretend you are still having fun. He listened in a way that made me hear my own thoughts more clearly, not because he was intensely analytical, but because he was not busy preparing his turn to impress me. That alone almost unnerved me. I was so used to men trying to establish themselves within the first 10 minutes, showing off, steering, positioning, revealing their status through anecdotes, that Christian's attentiveness felt oddly intimate. He asked questions that opened things instead of closing them. He looked at me like I was saying something worth understanding. He had a dry sense of humor that came out in little flashes, subtle enough that you had to be paying attention. By the end of the night, my social battery should have been dead, but instead I found myself irritated when people began putting on coats. When he asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, it felt disarmingly simple. No swagger, no strategic coolness, just a clean invitation. I said yes before I could overthink it. Our first few dates felt like stepping into a room with better air. We walked through an art museum on a gray Saturday and got sidetracked in front of a portrait because he noticed the subject's hands before he noticed her face. We had dinner at a small Italian place where he admitted he hated performative fine dining and preferred restaurants that cared more about the food than whether the menu could intimidate you. We spent an hour once sitting in his parked car outside my building because the conversation had drifted from childhood to shame to loneliness to the strange private myths people build around themselves, and neither of us wanted to be the one to end it. With him, I felt no pressure to become a shinier, simpler version of myself. I could be thoughtful, messy, contradictory, sensitive, odd. I could start a sentence without already planning how to make it more palatable. I noticed his apartment the first time I went there because it told the truth about him before he said another word. It was warm and elegant and deeply lived in. There were cream-colored throws folded over the sofa, art books stacked under a brass reading lamp, a ceramic tray by the door for keys and sunglasses, a small bowl of green pears on the kitchen counter. The place smelled faintly of cedarwood, laundry, and something powdery and expensive I couldn't identify. Nothing about it screamed for masculine approval. It wasn't trying to reassure anyone that a real man lived there. It was beautiful in a calm, sincere way. Curated, but not sterile. Personal, but not cluttered. The sort of home that made my whole body unclench when I walked in. It was on my third date there, after takeout and wine and a long, drifting conversation on the couch, that he told me about the cross-dressing. He was nervous. I could see it before he said a word. Not fidgety exactly, because he was not the kind of person who fell apart outwardly, but more careful than usual, as if he were carrying something in both hands and needed me not to move too suddenly. The room was lit mostly by the lamp in the corner and a candle on the kitchen island. Outside, the city had gone dark and glossy with recent rain. I had one leg tucked under me on the sofa, and he was sitting beside me, shoulders slightly tense. He said, "I want to tell you something because I like you, and if this is going to become anything, I don't want it to be built on me trimming parts of myself away." That sentence went through me like music. It wasn't just what he was saying, it was the framework itself, the assumption that intimacy required truth, the refusal to offer me a curated version of himself and call that closeness. I remember setting down my wine glass very carefully because suddenly the whole atmosphere in the room felt charged. Then he told me that he cross-dressed sometimes, that he had for years, that he loved soft fabrics, feminine silhouettes, delicate details, that sometimes under his office clothes, under his pressed slacks and belt and button-down shirt and polished leather shoes, he wore pretty panties because the feeling grounded him in a way he had trouble explaining. He said it made him feel calm, private, connected to himself. Not like he was pretending to be someone else, but like he was allowing more of himself to exist at once. He said he understood if that scared me off. He said it while watching my face with the quiet terror of someone who has been laughed at before. And what I felt immediately was not fear. It was tenderness so sharp it almost hurt. Not because I found the disclosure shocking, not because it felt illicit, not because I wanted to turn him into some fantasy. I felt tenderness because this was one of the most honest things anyone I had dated had ever said to me. This man, who could easily have kept performing ordinary masculinity and probably gotten away with it indefinitely, was trusting me with something intimate and potentially costly. He was not trying to dominate the moment. He was not trying to manipulate my response. He was simply telling the truth and hoping it wouldn't cost him love. I asked him, very quietly, "How does it make you feel?" And I watched the answer arrive in his eyes before it reached his mouth. "Soft," he said. "Calm. A little hidden, but in a good way. Like I'm carrying a version of myself nobody else has access to. Like I'm more fully there." Something in me opened when he said that. I think attraction is often described too visually, as if beauty were just a matter of surfaces lining up correctly. But some of the deepest attraction I have ever felt has happened in moments like that, when someone reveals the emotional shape of their desire or comfort, when they tell you not just what they do, but what it means inside them. Hearing Christian describe that private softness under the structure of his work clothes was unexpectedly sensual to me, yes, but also deeply moving. It felt poetic, human, brave. It made me want to move closer, not away. So I did. I touched his hand first, then his wrist. Then I leaned in and kissed him, slowly, because I wanted him to feel what my words might not be enough to prove, that I wasn't repulsed, that I wasn't indulging him, that I genuinely wanted to know him there. The first time I saw him dressed the way he wanted to be dressed remains one of the most beautiful moments of my adult life. And I don't mean that in a sensational way. I mean beautiful in the truest sense, as in emotionally exact, aesthetically tender, almost holy in its vulnerability. He asked if I wanted to see. He did not assume. He did not spring it on me. He asked with this careful steadiness that made the whole moment feel rooted in trust. I said yes. He disappeared into the bedroom, and for the minute or two that he was gone, I sat on the couch with my pulse climbing, listening to small movements from the other room, a drawer opening, hangers shifting, the faint hush of fabric. When he came back, he was wearing a black sweater that slipped a little off one shoulder, a pleated skirt in a smoky gray, and sheer stockings that made his legs look impossibly elegant. His hair had been brushed differently, softer around his face. He wasn't wearing makeup, just his own face, nervous and open and almost unbearably sincere. He did not look like he was mocking femininity. He did not look like he was wearing a costume. He looked like a quieter, more vivid version of himself had stepped forward. That was what caught me. Not transformation, exactly. Revelation. I stood up so slowly I could hear the friction of my own jeans against the couch. The lamplight turned the room golden at the edges. His hands were clasped too tightly in front of him, and I could see him bracing for a verdict he hated himself for needing. I walked over and touched the sleeve of his sweater between my fingers. It was soft as breath. I looked up at him and said, "You're gorgeous." I have never seen relief move through another person so visibly. He exhaled, his shoulders dropped, and then he smiled at me, small and incredulous, like maybe the room had just tilted in his favor after years of expecting it not to. That night changed something fundamental in me. It made me realize how much of what I had previously called sexual tension was really just anxiety sharpened into attraction. With Christian, sensuality did not feel like conquest, or choreography, or one person proving dominance over another. It felt collaborative, atmospheric, built out of texture and trust and mutual permission. It was the rustle of fabric in lamplight. It was the intimacy of seeing what softness looked like on him and feeling my own body respond not to force, but to authenticity. There is something profoundly alluring to me about the private details of him. The idea that he can button himself into a crisp shirt for work, knot a tie, step into polished shoes, and carry himself through the world as an apparently ordinary professional man, all while something delicate rests against his skin underneath. Not because it is scandalous, not really. The appeal is not just taboo. The appeal is the hidden tenderness of it, the knowledge that under all the visible structure, all the masculine signals that make other people comfortable, he is quietly keeping faith with a softer truth about himself. I love that secrecy, not because secrets are inherently romantic, but because some forms of privacy are intimate in a beautiful way. There is an inner life there, a little silent pulse of self-knowledge, a refusal to let the world flatten him. And yes, I find it sexy. I do. I find it sexy that he is not at war with femininity. I find it sexy that pretty things do not threaten him. I find it sexy that he can let softness live in his body without treating it like humiliation. The men I dated before often acted as if femininity was decorative at best and contaminating at worst. They wanted it near them, on women, available for their pleasure and status, but not in themselves, not in any way that might complicate their certainty about who they were. Christian is different. He does not approach femininity like a border to defend. He approaches it like a language he is allowed to speak too. That changed the feeling of our whole relationship. With the jock types, I often felt watched in a narrowing way. Desired, yes, but also assessed. How did I look from this angle? Was I performing sexiness correctly? Was I being feminine in the approved proportions? Even admiration could feel flattening because it was directed at the version of me that best fit the role they wanted. But with Christian, desire feels much roomier. Less like being looked at, more like being perceived. I can feel feminine around him without feeling reduced to femininity. I can feel messy, playful, undone, complicated, and still entirely wanted. One of my clearest memories is a Sunday afternoon in his bedroom, the kind of slow afternoon that seems to float outside ordinary time. The blinds were half open, and pale stripes of sunlight stretched across the bed and floor. The city outside had that softened weekend hum, distant traffic, a siren far away, the faint clatter of somebody moving furniture 3 floors below. I had just showered. My hair was still damp and cool down my back. On impulse, I put on nothing but a pair of black pantyhose, sheer and silky and slightly old-fashioned in a way that made me feel elegant and bare at once. If I had done that with one of the men I used to date, I would have immediately become conscious of the image of myself. Was it hot enough? Was it weird? Was it trying too hard? Was I accidentally doing something they'd find ridiculous? But when I stepped into the bedroom and Christian looked up at me, all of that static disappeared. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in a soft, charcoal knit top, his expression warm and open, and the smile that spread across his face was so genuine that I started smiling before I even reached him. There was no mockery in his gaze, no conquest, no detached male evaluation, just delight, just tenderness, just a kind of reverent appreciation that made me feel more embodied instead of more self-conscious. I remember the exact sensory details of that moment because that is how love fixes itself in my mind now. The cool wood floor under my feet, the smell of coffee still lingering from the kitchen, the thin cling of the pantyhose over my skin, the white sheets rumpled in sunlight, the warmth of his hands when he reached for mine. I climbed into his lap laughing because my feet were cold, and he kissed my fingers, then my wrist, then rested his forehead briefly against my shoulder in this little gesture of affection so unguarded it nearly undid me. Nothing about that afternoon was loud. Nothing about it needed to be. And yet it felt more intimate than so many supposedly passionate moments I had with other men because it was not powered by ego. It was powered by mutual softness, mutual play, mutual consent to inhabit each other gently. That, more than anything, is why being with him feels so different emotionally. The manly men I dated often related to emotion as if it were an interruption to the real business of life, something to manage, minimize, or outrun. If I was upset, they wanted a fast route to resolution because my feelings made them feel ineffective. If they were hurt, they usually translated that hurt into irritation, sarcasm, or distance because vulnerability itself felt too exposing. Even when they cared, and many of them did, there was often a bottleneck in the relationship. So much tenderness backed up behind a dam of gender expectations. With Christian, there is no such bottleneck. Or if there is, he notices it and works on it instead of pretending it is just the natural order of things. If something scares him, he can say so. If something delights him, he says that too. If I hurt his feelings, he doesn't go cold and force me to decode him for 3 days. He tells me. If I feel fragile, he does not get visibly impatient with my humanity. He moves closer. He asks what I need. He apologizes without making me drag the apology out of him by the ankles. He receives care without acting diminished by it. That alone has made me realize how impoverished some of my past relationships were. I do not mean he is perfect. I actually distrust the idea of perfect men now more than ever. Perfection is usually just another performance. Christian can be avoidant sometimes when he is overwhelmed. He can retreat into overthinking. He sometimes worries too much about being misunderstood, which means he occasionally edits himself before I remind him he doesn't have to. But those are human flaws, not monuments to gender. We can meet each other there. We can talk. There is also something unexpectedly healing for me, as a woman, in being with a man who does not treat femininity as a service I provide him. Before Christian, I didn't even realize how often I felt that way in heterosexual relationships. Like my softness, beauty, emotional labor, and aesthetic effort were part of the offering, and his masculinity was the solid structure that received it. With him, femininity is not a one-way resource. It is something more fluid, something we can both approach, interpret, borrow from, enjoy. That has made me feel less trapped in my own gender, too. Dating him has made me feel more feminine, but paradoxically in a freer way. Not more feminine because he is less masculine, which would be a simplistic and insulting way to understand him. He is a man. He is simply a man whose relationship to gender is more expansive, more conscious, more aesthetically alive. Being with him has made me realize that I feel safest in my own femininity when I am not being policed into it, when it isn't a duty or a contrast effect or an assignment. I can wear lipstick and heels and a clingy dress, or no makeup and a giant sweatshirt and messy hair, and none of it feels like I am either succeeding or failing at womanhood. It just feels like expression. He gave me that without trying to, just by being honest himself. Sometimes I think back to all those men whose identities seemed built like fortresses, and I feel something close to grief. Not desire, not nostalgia, grief. Because I can see now that many of them were starving too. Starving for permission, starving for softness, starving for a version of masculinity that did not require constant self-erasure. Some of them may never have wanted what Christian wants specifically, but I suspect many of them wanted some form of release from the performance and never found it. So they clung harder to the role. They made their bodies more impressive, their emotions more opaque, their preferences more predictable. They became what the world rewarded and called that freedom. But I am no longer interested in being loved by someone who is only free inside a cage. I want the man who lets beauty touch him. I want the man who knows that sensuality can be quiet. I want the man who understands that softness is not the opposite of strength. I want the man who can go to work in a tailored suit with secret lace or silk beneath it and still handle his day with competence and calm, not because he is playing two incompatible selves, but because both selves were always his. I want the man who can look at me across a room and share a private smile that says, You know me more fully than the world does, and I trust you with that. There are mornings now when I stand in Christian's doorway with a coffee mug warming both hands and watch him get dressed for work. The light in his apartment in the early morning is cooler, almost silver before the sun fully rises. His white shirt catches it first. He buttons the cuffs, smooths the placket, tucks the fabric into his charcoal trousers, threads the belt, ties the knot at his throat with practiced fingers. To anyone else, it would be such an ordinary image, a composed, attractive man preparing for a professional day, the kind of scene no one would look at twice. But I know what lives under that ordinariness. I know the tenderness folded beneath the structure. I know that maybe under the pressed lines and neutral colors and polished shoes, he is carrying some private softness against his skin. I know that he moves through the world every day with more complexity than most people will ever suspect. Sometimes he catches my eye in the mirror, and there is this tiny flash of conspiratorial warmth between us. Not embarrassment, not shame, just intimacy. A shared truth. The knowledge that the world may read him one way, but I have been invited deeper. That feeling is intoxicating. Not because it makes me feel superior to anyone else, because it makes me feel close to something real. So when I say I like dating men who cross-dress more than manly men, I know some people will hear only the surface of that sentence. They will think I am trying to be provocative. They will assume I mean I have a novelty preference or a fetish or some reaction against traditional masculinity for the sake of making a point. But what I mean is far more personal and far less performative than that. I mean that my most fulfilling relationship with a man has been with someone who is not imprisoned by masculinity. I mean that I have discovered how sensual honesty can be. I mean that I would rather be desired by someone who understands softness from the inside than by someone who worships hardness because he is afraid of what tenderness would reveal. I mean that there is something deeply erotic to me about a man who can wear pretty panties under office clothes and still move through the day with grace, intelligence, and self-possession, because that kind of self-knowledge is infinitely more attractive than loud certainty. I mean that when I wear nothing but pantyhose around Christian, I do not feel like an object. I feel like a participant in a shared atmosphere of trust, beauty, and play. I mean that the emotional life of our relationship is richer because neither of us is spending all our energy defending a role. I mean that being loved by a full person is more satisfying than being adored by a stereotype. And maybe most of all, I mean that I am tired of the lie that manly automatically means better. Better protector, better lover, better partner, better anchor. In my experience, what matters is not whether a man performs masculinity convincingly. What matters is whether he knows himself well enough to offer you something real, whether he can be gentle without feeling erased, whether he can receive beauty without trying to own it, whether he can meet your vulnerability with his own instead of with a mask. Christian can. That is why I love him. That is why the little details undo me. The whisper of fabric, the calm confidence in his posture, the tenderness in his eyes when I touch his sleeve, the secret softness under formal clothes, the private smile in the mirror, the way he makes room for my own complexity without trying to sort it into pink and blue boxes. That is why what we have feels not only sexy, but strangely liberating. It feels like stepping out of a noisy room I didn't realize had been exhausting me for years. And after all the jocks, all the hard bodies and harder silences, all the rigid little ceremonies of traditional straight dating, I can finally say this without hesitation. Nothing has felt more attractive to me than a man who is brave enough to be soft, beautiful enough to be honest, and secure enough to let femininity live close to his skin. With Christian, I don't feel like I'm dating a category. I feel like I'm in love with a person, a radiant, layered, tender, unexpectedly fearless person. And that is more than better. That is everything.